Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Patrick Temple-West. I am a journalist at the Financial Times. I cover sustainability issues, and I'm happy to have everybody here today for our morning panels, and I'd like to get started. I believe we have one person joining on Zoom, if that's correct. But first, I'd like to introduce Damiola Ugombe-Biye, who is Head of Sustainable Energy for All. And next to her is Martin Kimani, the ambassador to Kenya. We're going to be talking a little bit about the challenges around food, fuel, and finance. Damiola, I wanted to see if you could just start by talking a little bit about your role at Sustainable Energy for All. What does that look like? What does sort of the day job involve?
Okay, so thank you for having me to start. The job is really about achieving SDG 7, so that's kind of affordable, sustainable energy for everybody. People mistake energy for just electricity, but it's also clean cooking. It's also raising the amount of renewable energy we actually use. So I have a dual role. I have the role of the head of Sustainable Energy for All, but I also have a role at the UN in terms of being the special representative to make sure that Sustainable Development Goal 7 happens. And why it's so important is that to achieve pretty much all the other sustainable development goals, you need energy, you need electricity. So every day we advocate for possibly about 733 million people that have no access to electricity, who can't be on Zoom calls or be here with us today. But even more staggering, 2.4 billion people with no access to clean cooking, which kills probably about 4 million women a year. So it's not a good position to be in. And we just keep on emphasizing the need that to achieve even our climate goals, we cannot do that if we leave people behind.
Great. And Martin, if you have some opening thoughts on the food, fuel, and finance issues, how are you thinking about that in your role and representation of Kenya?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and good morning to everybody. I think it's a really simple answer, and that's which is that my job is to find every way that the UN can offer solutions and relief to Kenyan people and to citizens all over the world who are suffering from a number of crises that have all come together at the same time, contributing to a rapid deterioration in quality of life, in livelihoods, in the affordability of life. I think I saw on the advertisement for this meeting the phrase, the greatest cost of living increase in a generation. That phrase evokes there's so much suffering going on in Kenya and elsewhere, and I think the multilateral system needs to respond far more robustly than is the case. And so we need ideas, but even beyond those ideas, which are always plentiful, we need the will and the determination to push them through. This is the time I think the UN is going to demonstrate to the world, and at least to Kenyan citizens, whether it really is fit for purpose.
Thank you, Martin. How can, we've established some of the challenges here. How can the UN help facilitate some of these solutions? We're coming up on the General Assembly next week. How are you thinking about how the UN can catalyze its role in addressing some of these challenges?
Well, like the Kenyan ambassador said, it's all about delivery on ground now. It's not about talking about what to do. It has to actually be about impact. There are two things that the UN has done. Last year, there was actually a high-level dialogue on energy, and that was the first time in 40 years. And you have to really put that in context, because we have numerous climate conferences every single year, but it was the first time in 40 years that we all sat down as a global community and said, what are we going to do? So one of the key deliverables that came out of that were energy compacts, where companies, countries, NGOs had to come together and say, what am I going to do to achieve SDG 7 by 2030?
Yes.
So this wasn't a 2050 target, it was a 2030. And a couple of days, there will be the report of that progress. one of the key parts that we were pushing was finance on ground, obviously. There were a lot of pledges made, but how do you actually get the funding to the countries that need them? In my previous role, I was head of the Rural Electrification Agency for Nigeria.
Yeah.
And, that context, you have to provide power for 90 million people. And I went through a World Bank, program, and I went through an AFDB program. And it typically takes between 2 and 5 years to get across any of those programs that are meant to help you at warp speed to achieve your targets. So that's a very, very key part of it. The other part that we're doing recently with David as well, actually, is the Global Crisis Response Group, which the SG put together on food, fuel, and energy. So I co-chair the energy piece. And we've just come up with a set of recommendations now. Again, looking at the disbursement rates of DFIs, I'm not sure if people know, but barely about 37% of money that's been allocated for energy projects has actually been disbursed. So there's probably a few, like 20 or 25 billion that is kind of sitting with the banks that can be dispersed quickly, and understanding what those bottlenecks are, if it's the country level interventions or the UN interventions has to come into play. And another thing that we are seriously taking in consideration now is the voluntary carbon market, especially for the African continent. And Africa, who is probably about 2% of the current carbon market, could really benefit for that. And then finally, this narrative of energy access here and energy transition over there really has to change. And what we have been saying is that energy access for many countries is the energy transition. It was actually quite sad. I was in Kigali a few months ago, and I was talking to a bunch of young people, and they were like, can we transition to energy first before you tell us to transition into something else? And that really struck me. We laughed for a bit, but the truth of the matter is, if you still have a continent, at least sub-Saharan Africa, that has 81 gigawatts for 1 billion people, that means just the fact that you're born Black African, you're 20 times at a disadvantage than any other human being on Earth. It's actually quite shocking when you look at some of these stats, and those are the people even with energy. So when we do talk about, multiple crises at the same time, we do have to consider this. While it's very, very important for us to obviously support what is happening with the war, the fact that aid budgets are being cut for really critical areas is also a problem. And that's our real focus at the UN right now, and sustainable energy for all.
Can I follow up with you on something you said about the bottlenecks? Are there any strategies, tools that you are thinking about, hopefully excited about, in the months ahead to unlock that capital?
I mean, there are 2 programs I'm quite excited about. I guess first is not even a program. I think one of the things I've noticed in my last couple of years at the UN is just the power of the UN, the power of certain people to just pick up the phone and call another person, and certain things are unlocked. It's quite remarkable. I've never seen anything like that before. But the other one is, we are working very strongly with a group called the Global Alliance for People and Planet, which is born out of the Rockefeller Foundation,
Okay.
IKEA Foundation, and also the Bezos Earth Fund, who's bringing a lot of philanthropic money into the space to help de-risk. And they're also supporting the DFIs as well, because, all roads do come back to DFIs and MDBs at the end of the day, but also supporting countries to make sure that they're well equipped. So, for example, with the Just Energy Transition Program in South Africa, having a team work with the South African government on how to actually deliver them that are actually South Africans are actually really important. And they're doing the same thing in Nigeria and I believe Vietnam. So I think all that type of intervention and innovation is very key in the space, knowing that we have, at least for SDG 7, 7 years to go.
And just briefly for folks in the audience who might not know the acronyms, IFI?
Sorry.
That's okay.
DFI, Development Finance Institution, basically the World Bank.
Right. And NDBs?
MDBs, Multilateral Development Bank.
Yes.
God, yeah, so AFDB, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, people like that.
Martin, a similar question to you. Are there examples that you are excited about how capital can be unlocked for these these projects?
Well, you have to begin with the fact that there is a great deal of debt that the poorest countries and regions have accumulated over the last decade. And this is partly cyclical. After the financial crisis in 2008, then there were countries that then came back to the capital markets and started accumulating debt to invest in various national projects, whether it's energy or infrastructure. And that has reduced the amount of fiscal space many governments have. So I think the immediate priority is how countries, and especially the most vulnerable, can have more assistance in how they will deal with their fiscal space. And of course, there is a debt process within the IMF and the Paris Club, and China has joined. I think, what is it called?
Is it the debt for climate swap?
No, there's a debt framework.
Okay.
There's a G20 debt framework that China has joined, and now has started restructuring debt to certain African countries. So that's going to need to happen. There are some that will, at the most fragile, may need forms of debt forgiveness, but others that are perhaps even more robust economically will need debt restructuring just to ensure that they have the fiscal space to get through this particular crisis. I think there's an appetite to do that, but there's insufficient speed. And what a lot of policymakers tend to do, we're much better at solving emergencies than preventing them. And so I think at this point, we are in an emergency, but in one of these almost slow-moving emergencies, because the experiences of people on the ground sometimes do not urgently enough touch our debates here in the UN. There's something very distant about how distant we are from the situation on the ground. So debt restructuring is one. Then there are commitments that have been made over time. For example, in dealing with the climate crisis, I think we should no longer call it climate change. We should just call it the climate crisis, which is having very apparent and dangerous effects globally, from Pakistan to the Horn of Africa.
Right.
We're going to need to do two things at the same time. One is a just transition of energy. But beyond pointing fingers at one another, there's a great deal of practical work that is needed to help governments cope at this specific time. We're going to need an entire generation of innovators from plant science all the way across the sciences and in different processes within government, just to enable states to begin to have the capabilities to at least mitigate the worst effects, even as they build up a more robust response. The UN has unique capabilities. I have found myself very impressed by the humanitarian capabilities of the UN. Of course, there are limits to them, but there's a lot the UN is experienced and good at doing that can be brought to use right now. And I think, so it becomes not creating necessarily new instruments. Some of those may be needed, of course, but about using the ones we have more effectively. And I hope the leaders who are coming here next week really concentrate that message of, one, uplifting the UN, but at the same time, trying to encourage and push for more implementation of the instruments we have. The World Bank, the IMF, they have the instruments, but their pace of implementation is far too slow.
And is that, I mean, I couldn't help but notice you were active on Twitter this morning, calling for the need for stronger multilateral responses. And these are some of the examples that you're thinking of for that. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, as long as multilateralism has existed, at least in the last century, there's always been complaints about its inadequacy.
Right.
But at this stage, I think we have entered a new chapter of reconsidering our entire framework. And it's the same thing I said before, we're being tested. More than ever before, Kenyan citizens and other citizens are asking, these institutions, are they sufficient for us? Are they going to do the job? And I think that's the challenge before us. But I also wanted to say something very quickly. Sorry. Beyond the immediate emergency, there's I find myself quite puzzled about what the future portends. The conflicts that are going on, whether it's Ukraine or the conflicts between the major powers, are leading to a fundamental reshaping of the global economy. So the way the sanctions and the blockades, the weaponization of food and fertilizer,
Right.
the way they're all working is changing what we broadly call the globalization model. And countries like my own and other countries had committed themselves and tried to align themselves to develop sustainably through globalization. A lot of those doors are not necessarily closed, but they've shifted,
Yeah.
right? And so what is going to be the engine of growth, the engine of job creation? How are the export markets going to look when there is such fundamental change due to the conflict between the major powers? So it seems to me that the war in Ukraine and its implications in terms of how the major powers relate to each other are going to be felt by all of us for a long time to come.
Definitely. Demilola, on a more positive note, I noticed you've been active on Twitter, and can you talk a little bit about the project, the electricity project in Madagascar? You mentioned that it was opening opportunities for learning. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that might be an example of a positive solution?
Yes, one of the things that, and especially when I took over this role, is how do you have delivery of direct impact on ground. So there's a program we run called the Universal Energy Facility, which is a results-based financing facility, and this is how it works. When companies connect remote villages or communities to solar power, either through solar mini-grids or solar standalone systems for productive use, and they see it's working and it's all metered and they're collecting money, we provide a subsidy. And what that subsidy does is kind of like that viability gap, because it's not just about providing people power, it also has to be affordable.
Yeah.
So there's no point, giving people power and then charging them the same thing they would charge you in the United States on a dollar tariff, right? So you have to really understand the nuances of that community. And what it also does in terms of the learning is that it allows something we always forget about, which is local currency debt and local currency funding. The people in Madagascar or in Sierra Leone or in Kenya, they're not paying in dollars.
Yes.
So we hedge everything with the dollar, right? And then something goes to the dollar, you're going back to, some poor woman who has a little stall and say, okay, can you pay 3 times your electricity bill? And we found that a lot during COVID, all the dynamics change. The other thing that, I'm particularly, I particularly want to push during my reign of sustainability at SE4 is just local developers, local African developers. Because we've also found out that for so many years they've been subcontractors to larger companies, and the space is so big. There's like 600 million people to power. There's space for international developers, local developers, state developers, but we do have to make that concerted effort for African developers. And it's something I take very seriously, and even when you're applying for the grant, there are some nuances there that allow local developers to get through, because they might not have 5 years audited accounts. They might not be lucky enough to have done their Series A, B, C. All those things that people just assume. No, but they are still very capable. They understand the space a lot, and we do have to, we have to develop that African ecosystem. And that is what we're doing. So we've powered this first community in Madagascar. The next one's going to be in Sierra Leone, I believe, and then in Benin.
Okay.
And then we've just opened one in my country, Nigeria, but that's for productive use. And that, again, is very exciting because that's for SMEs. And one of the outcomes of that is that the SME employs one other person.
Yeah.
The job creation and the whole GDP growth thing is something that's very exciting.
Well, that was going to be my follow-up question is, do you think that Madagascar project can be replicated? And it sounds like it already is.
Yes. But you have to look at the different localities as well. So if I was going to do a project in Kenya, it will probably be standalone system for productive uses, and this would probably go into agriculture, solar irrigation and things like that. So you can't, again, I know, and I'm harping on Africa, that's not all we do. We do stuff in Asia as well. But we can't look at a country and a continent and say, this is the one solution. You don't only have to look at countries in specific ways. You have to look at the states you're going into, because they're huge, and they also, and I think that's the issue, kind of localizing some of our solutions so they really thrive. I think we've made mistakes on, like, oh, this worked in Nigeria, so of course it's going to work in South Africa. So of course it doesn't happen in real life. So we spend a lot of time analyzing and also getting the government support to implement any of these programs. That's also very, very important, because it drives the enabling environment for the developer.
Martin, optimistic on what Damilola was talking about here?
I think if we do what she wants, everything will be fine.
So that's it.
I think Damilola is just demonstrating practicality and ambition. And I think our job, the rest of us who are either at a more political space, is how to align our political process to those practical outcomes. The truth is, I am optimistic about, first, yes, your role is global, but I'm very optimistic about a generation of Africans who are really looking to push the envelope in Africa. And in Kenya itself, between what the government has done in terms of electricity access, in terms of infrastructure, etc., beside that, there's a lot of social and business innovation going on. So I am optimistic. If I sound pessimistic, it's because I think we are inadequately supporting these innovators and actors on the ground.
I agree.
Okay. you want to add anything to that? Or
I think there's just, unfortunately, there's this perception of risk going into the African continent that's just not right. Mm-hmm. There's this perception that if I do this and it fails here, everything goes wrong. But there's not the perception of just how much opportunity there is when things go right. It's probably one of the few continents that you can get double-digit, interest or profit back. And, there are a lot of people doing some amazing things, and they happen to be, very, very young Africans. So that is all I would add to that, come in, understand the space. If you need any guidance, contact us. And, it's really, really important to invest in the space and understand the opportunity as well. It's not just an aid and grant project. Mm-hmm. There's actually money to be made in the space.
I want to follow up about that, but first I want to bring in David Nambaro, again, co-director, Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College. David, just to thank you again for joining us this morning, but if you have any initial thoughts on some of the challenges and opportunities for the fuel, food, and finance issues that we're facing today.
Thank you very much. First of all, what a joy to hear Damilola Ogunbiyi and His Excellency, the Ambassador, talking about the issues as they see them. I'd just say that I agree from the perspective of food systems and health, the issues that have been identified are right. The future of development in Africa, or indeed in all low and middle income countries, is not aid from the West. It is support for the build-up of capacity within country. We can accompany, but we should not see ourselves in any way as more than supporters. After all, we're not exactly, in many higher income countries, doing brilliantly right now. But if we look around the world, there is a major food crisis happening, and that's leading to a lot of people unable to purchase the food that they need for good nutrition through the money that they have in their pocket. That's because costs are rising, and also the purchasing power of the shillings or rupees in their pocket is reducing. So what does that mean? It means that there are tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people in our world who are just getting poorer at breakneck speed. It's a big slide into poverty. A lot of the gains that were made in the last 25 years through concerted efforts by many national governments are just slipping away out of our grasp. People getting poorer quickly is a terrible situation. It leads to hundreds of millions of people in difficulty and millions of people actually probably getting into extreme challenges with major food shortages. Do you know there have been 5 consecutive rain failures in the northeast of Africa because of climate change? And what that's doing is just making it virtually impossible for households to build up any kind of storage in their homes, and they are unable to get the food they need. So we're anticipating that more people than ever are going to become food insecure and hungry in the coming weeks, unless the world can turn on the most extraordinary collective operation. This will be the biggest and most serious food crisis we've known. But it's not just that. Just quickly, I want to say farmers can't get the fertilizer they need to plant their fields when the rains do come. And they are also having to pay an awful lot to get their produce to market. So there's a real challenge for small scale farmers all over the world. There are 500 million of them, and a big chunk of them are likely to go out of business together with the companies, the small companies that support them. Finally, just to say, who's going to be hurt as a result of all this? Answer: women and children. That's what always happens when times get bad, especially in poorer households. But we are very concerned that we're going to see a big increase in child malnutrition, which has many, many years of impact on their well-being over time. Thanks very much.
So, David, where are the opportunities? Where do you see, as the UN is gathering next week, where are there opportunities for multilateral benefits?
There are fantastic opportunities all over all regions. Last week being with many governments and those who support them in Africa, looking at food systems. No problem at all to find many young people who want to get into chicken rearing or better production of vegetables and grains, but they need investment. And the investment resources are insufficient, and that means that the opportunity requires the arrival of more capital within the bank accounts of national governments. Now, if, as Ambassador said, they've got very tight fiscal space in their finance ministry budgets, they're not able to support the longer term investment by farmers. And at the same time, they've got to try to find the resources to provide relief and social protection. So there's plenty of opportunity. There's lots of good soil and opportunity for energy production and great markets for food all over the world. But it's the cash for investment that's difficult, and many countries just in really tight situation, partly because of debt and partly because their fiscal headroom is so narrow. It means expanding the funds available to poor countries. That means a generous approach to financing from the governors of institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, which are the rich nations of the world.
Thank you, David. Demilula Martin, question for you. We've talked about the IMF, World Bank, other multilateral financing opportunities. What about Wall Street banks? We write a lot about how the global banking community is trying to build its sustainability efforts, and they are looking at opportunities to do project finance. Do you see opportunities, partnerships, funding from the Wall Street crowd?
I have to be careful for this. Of course, there's the opportunity. It's if they're interested. So most of these institutions, they find countries like Indonesia and India risky. So if countries that are they're risky, the likelihood they come into the real developing countries and the SIDS is lacking, and it is very, very hard, even within those institutions, to find like a proper Africa desk. You know, I've tried. You know, who's your focal point on this? You know, it's extremely difficult. So, yes, there's opportunity, but they have to want to do it. You know, you can push, you can advocate, but they have to want to do it. So that's the challenge that I found with Wall Street.
Martin?
Well, I can't speak for Wall Street, but I do know that at a time of crisis, the tendency of capital is to move to what it perceives to be safety.
Right.
which is essentially to move out of, quote, emerging markets and back into more developed markets, especially when interest rates are rising in the richest part of the world. There's more of an incentive to come back here. And
Yes.
that landscape of risk and geopolitical risk is foremost in the minds of a lot of people. Part of the opportunity, I think, is that the geopolitical risks and the pandemic risks and the pandemic realities we just faced have made a lot more companies start to think about how to shift their supply and production
Yes.
chains. And so there are companies that will feel that even in the older model, it was cost and efficiency that predominated in where you located your production and your supplies. Now there's an added layer of risk from geopolitics. Mm-hmm. And COVID made a lot of people aware that their countries, as rich and technologically advanced as they were, don't produce masks, don't produce the basics needed in hospitals.
Right.
There's an opportunity for some of that recasting of supply chains and production chains to touch on other regions. So I think there's no reason why you should not consider Kenya or Ghana or Botswana or South Africa to shift some of your manufacturing out of certain parts of the world to Kenya and et cetera. So there's that opportunity, which I think is an opportunity that would need to be financed, but not financing Kenya, but financing a large multinational to shift some of its supply chains to Kenya. Away from that reshifting of production, which I think is a very real opportunity for job creation and wealth creation, is the fact that a lot more of the private money will need to follow government money.
Yes.
So if you saw the Biden administration, there's an ambition to bring together the different development funds within the US government and direct. The next step now is to put enough people, enough expertise in those bodies so that they are able to respond to her projects.
Yes.
The projects are there, the people who are doing are there, but now it is the US, the UK, and other different countries that have development funding of one kind or another to respond. And if they do that, then the private money may be able to see the opportunity. If they do more of the de-risking of that private money, more of it may flow. Finally, African governments, and I think even the private sector, need to do more in the data space in terms of clarifying what this risk of investing in Africa is. A lot of it's like, my thinking, or at least my experience, is that investors are willing to take a spectrum of risks. There are those who are the most conservative to some who take a lot of risks in return for a lot of return. What they don't like is lack of a number to the risk.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Because then you're blind. You don't know if it's a high risk investment or a low risk investment. It's just, so we need to actually put data to the risk, and then you will find perhaps even investors that you had never traditionally expected to come into Africa ready to do so. There's a lot of work to do there in terms of data, in terms of availing that data in public, and in terms of making that data of high enough quality to make decisions with on Wall Street.
That's a really great point. David, any other thoughts on this about how to get more sort of the financial markets involved?
What a great conversation. Again, if we look at agriculture and food, one of the most important findings to come out of the COVID outbreaks and also the current crisis, mostly triggered by climate change and conflict, is that systems have just got to be more resilient. That's a word that is now more and more being used. I think at the beginning, people worried that it was perhaps meaning a little bit of a slowdown on growth, just go for resilience. But after we've seen what COVID did, people are turning around and looking at each other and saying, we can't be sitting in a situation where our supply chains can so easily get blocked, or our producers find that their markets are completely broken. So the need for resilience is there on food, and that means more local production, less reliance on imports, less reliance on what comes from far away. And that means shorter and more agile supply chains. And the only way to get that is through the mingling of public and private finance. If I had one big request, that is just for more agriculture based lending by banks that know a bit about the kind of terms under which you have to lend if you're trying to bring farmers more in. It's not quite the same as other kinds of lending. We need more of it. And I agree totally with His Excellency that the combination of data, analysis, and connectivity is key to making these things work. If you want agile supply chains, connect the consumer with the producer and make certain that there are people to interpret in the middle. Thanks again.
Martin, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick appeal.
Yes.
When we talk about the just energy transition, we're going to also need to talk more and act more on a just fertilizer and agricultural transition, in the sense that Africa needs to produce more fertilizer for itself. Being a net importer of so much fertilizer is really not a sustainable way to undertake agriculture. As David said, farmers are waiting for fertilizer and it's getting more expensive. In Kenya, the government is having to step in to stabilize those prices and to give relief to farmers and try and provide cheaper fertilizer. But we need it to get even cheaper. Now, there is a part of the environmental lobby that is seeking climate change action that pushes back on increased fertilizer production, increased refining in Africa. And I think I get the overall desire to respond to the climate crisis, which is very real. But it's really important that the proposals that are being made for supporting fertilizer production in Africa to be supported and not to be seen as a threat to climate change mitigation or adaptation. Africans need food cheap. And lastly, I'll just say something about, as a member of the Security Council, when countries have populations that use more than 50% of their earnings for food, that is a key part of fragility, political fragility. So we have to solve this not just from the developmental perspective, but as a peace and security matter. If the prevention agenda really is a real agenda in the United Nations, then we can begin with food prices as a key indicator of, I think, a leading indicator of the prospects for stability, peace, and security. And finally, there's some actors. I keep saying finally, sorry.
No, that's okay, please. This is
There's some actors.
very valuable.
There's a bank called Afri-Exim Bank. And I have just noticed, I don't know anyone.
What was it called again? Sorry.
Afri-Exim Bank.
The Africa XM Bank.
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
I've noticed, without knowing much, that a lot of the innovative projects going on, a lot of the aggressive, bold projects going on, you get to hear the word Afri-Exim Bank. And it tells me that institutions with the imagination and the desire to engage can do a lot to change the picture as it stands.
Excellent. Excellent. I had one question for you, Demiola, but did you have anything you wanted to follow up on from what Martin was saying?
I just wanted to add that I think we have to understand that the energy transition is different for every single country, and it has to be just and it has to be equitable. It's not okay to say one side of the world do something when another side of the world is not doing that. And even in the case of fertilizers, I think the fertilizer we're even producing now on continent is being shipped out.
Okay.
Right? Because it's the highest bidder, and I understand that it's a private sector game, but we need to understand that a lot of things that we produce is also being sent out that is needed on continent. So when we talk about the just energy transition, this is where the piece on data is very key, is what does it actually take to be climate development and energy and food secure all in one package instead of saying one instead of the other, right? Because again, if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, if you take away South Africa from the equation, it's probably less than 1% of global emissions. You know, for me, it's quite crazy. Like, that's the place you start with your climate crisis, you know, and we do have to understand that. So again, 1 billion people develop out of poverty, you're going to use a bit more carbon. But that means the rest of the world has to use less carbon. And sometimes, you know, it really triggers me where we're choosing between climate and development.
Right.
We cannot do that. We have to have both in the equation. And it means that people who use a lot more have to use less to make sure Africa actually develops.
Can I ask, and just very briefly, because we have a couple questions from the audience, but voluntary carbon market, you mentioned that before.
Yes.
It's something that we're just starting. We were discussing. I've never heard of it 6 months ago. What is that, and what might your role be in facilitating that?
Okay, so what we're trying to develop is what would be the framework for a proper voluntary carbon market on the continent. Right now, probably Kenya is responsible for about 25% of the carbon that is actually traded. But even the cost and that Kenya carbon, you know, I don't want to get too technical, per ton gets is less than other countries, which is just not right. So understanding a quality standard that, well, and I think most of it is the Kenyan cook stoves, you know, that I think even some big high-end companies here buy from. So what we're trying to say is that, you know, the people who buy carbon credits, the deltas, the airlines and everything, what are you looking for? And what are the co-benefits? Because the difference with typical African carbon credits is that when you give somebody solar power, you're probably displacing a diesel genset as well. And you're giving them a better quality of life. So that's also a very important part. And I just want to touch on those issues, that the archetypes in the carbon market right now are not developed for the African market. One of the big transition in the African market is transition out of diesel and petrol gensets, of which there are about 100 million of it. And it's just as harmful as coal, basically. So, but there's no archetype of what happens in the carbon space if you displace that. So we're also challenging and saying that we need to have space for new types of carbon. So this work is going on over the next 3-4 months, and it'll be great to come back and touch. And we're also getting African leadership also interested in channeling that, so we have something to present by COP27.
Excellent. A couple questions from the audience, very much related to technology opportunities. One on low-tech approaches like the cooking you mentioned. Solar cooking, how can that be used to reduce cooking-related female mortality?
I mean, electric cooking is just as effective as LPG. But what people need to understand is the cost of electric cooking. If someone doesn't have electricity at all, you know, do you wait for electricity or do you give them something transitional? But we are testing a lot of different kind of electric cook stoves. I mean, I have some in my house. Everything I do is electric because I run on gas in America, which again is that's something that bothers me. That okay, it's probably the first time I'm actually cooking on gas in New York. So yeah, electric cook stoves are big, but we do have to get the cost down for everybody to afford it, and we have to also look at electricity and cooking programs as one. So when you are giving someone electricity, they're not still using fuel wood.
Right.
You are thinking of, how do you take up the entire energy need? And that, I think, is something that's going to jump out in the next few months, even with the development finance institutions.
Martin, similar question. Technology opportunities that you're seeing, thinking about, hopeful about?
What she said.
Okay.
No, look, in terms of technology opportunities, I think the Kenyan technology space is a very promising space. There's a lot. What I'd like to concentrate on just for a second is like wastewater management, right? You have increasingly, just like the energy kind of becoming a decentralized grid, even management of waste is also going to become decentralized. There's a lot of opportunity to build out the technology in Africa and many parts of Asia, India, for instance. But there's a need for financing model that allows people to have adequate wastewater management, and then the domino effects on public health, the domino effects on addressing water scarcity, which is a very real problem, in the Horn of Africa, and again that comes back down to the business model and the need for capital to build out that decentralized infrastructure. The technology is there. There's still some innovation to be done, but that lack of investment in that space makes it very difficult to build up that business model that then allows you to go household to household.
I just wanted to add that Kenya is actually leading the way in terms of financial clean tech with M-Pesa. You know,
M-Pesa, sorry, just define that for folks in the audience.
Oh, how do I describe M-Pesa?
It's mobile money.
It's mobile money, but it's gone on steroids now.
Yeah,
Like they can offer money for commodities. They can offer money for. I think they're the first people to have meters on even LPG canisters, which is quite innovative and reduces waste. But why it's so important was that it also adds the digitalization angle. Right. Again, so if you give people energy and then you can give them, access to the internet, and you give it all at the same time, and it's paid by a single platform, that platform is also worth a lot.
Yeah.
So, and it's really the Kenyan model that not only happening in Africa, but parts of Asia and around the world are really looking at it and say, how can we replicate this? So there's a lot of innovation going on in Kenya right now.
David, any thoughts about this technology opportunities?
Totally. I think we're all agreed. Mm-hmm. The technology is just there that enables things to happen at a different speed and in a different way compared with, for example, what might have happened in my own country, the UK. I just say two other things. The incentives are changing. Again, Ambassador said, His Excellency, his remarks were, there ought to be more fertilizer production in Africa. I predict there will be an enormous upsurge in fertilizer production within the continent because of the high cost of production in Europe because of the rise in gas prices. Secondly, I think that there's also going to be a lot of interest in new processes for fertilizer production, including green ammonia. That's ammonia made through sustainable energy, and that will grow very, very fast indeed. So just to say that anybody who's listening and watching, who's got finance that they wish to invest, I would say that energy and food in many African countries, many developing countries, represents an extraordinary investment opportunity with medium-term high returns. And this is likely to be something that will be a sort of crowd-in effect in the coming months and years if the incentives stay as they are right now. Thanks for the chance to be with you. I'm slipping off now.
Thank you, David. And I think we are out of time for this panel. So, David, thank you again. Demilola, Martin, thanks so much for participating this morning.
Thank you for having us.
Ambassador, how are you?
You? Yes.
Hi. Jayatma. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Chilo.
Shimi. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'm thinking the same thing. I'm literally trying to familiarize with what I have on this paper.
Just bear with us one second. We have one other guest joining on Zoom again. We are good to go. Okay. Well, I would like to.
John, are you able to sit?
Say again?
Good. Okay. Well, again, thanks everybody for joining us this morning. We're going to be talking about rescuing the Sustainable Development Goals here. And I'm joined by Chido Mbapa, Special Envoy on Youth to African Union, and Jayathma Wickramanayake, UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. And we're joining remotely by John MacArthur, Director of Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institute. John, are you in Washington?
Yes,
Okay.
for my sins. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Chido, I wanted to see if you could start us off by talking a bit about your role, the Sustainable Development Goals. How are you seeing the efforts in accomplishing the goals that have been laid out?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. First of all, it's such an honor to be here and also joined by my colleague, the UN Secretary General's Youth Envoy. I think when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, I'll be biased being the Youth Envoy for Africa, and I'll base it on that. I think it's important that we incorporate the young people, especially from the context of Africa, because Africa has the youngest demographic as the youth. And young people bring about innovation. And if we need growth, we need to involve them through that innovation. And this goes about board when we speak about, public health, if we speak about economic development and social development itself. We cannot have progress without involving the young people. But when we involve the young people, we also need to ensure that we have an enabling environment to how we're going to involve them. And that would take an intergenerational approach, ensuring that we give them access. This access comes to access to opportunities, access for growth. At times it can even mean access to financing for them to grow in terms of developing when it comes to sustainability in the SDGs, as well as the Agenda 2063. The Agenda 2063 is also anchored on the Sustainable Development Goals, but focuses on aspirations that are specific to Africa. For example, Aspiration 6, it talks about, potential of the youth, using the potential of the youth and women, that we need that in Africa, whose development shall rely on the potential of its youth and its women. So therefore, having said that, we will be able to achieve them, but only so if we join hands with the youth, intergenerational approach, as well as a multi-sectoral approach, a regional, international cooperation and integration is important too. Yeah.
Jayathma, any thoughts on how to get back on track?
Thank you, Peter. I think the best thing about Chido's and my job is that we get to interact and work with young people around the world on a one-to-one basis that, many of the senior leaders in our organizations or senior leaders in government often don't do or don't care to do. And what I'm hearing from young people around the world is a lot of anxiety, a lot of frustration, a lot of uncertainty about their own future and about their own lives. So a lot of it has to do with our elected leaders or our leaders at the international community continuously making these promises that they never live up to. So when you ask me what needs to be done to achieve the SDGs, I would say first accountability, second accountability, third accountability. We have to live up to the commitments we have made. We have this amazing roadmap, the 2030 agenda ahead of us. So let's invest back in it. Let's make sure, as the Secretary General says, we rescue the SDGs, not only for people who are living in this planet today, but also for the future generations.
Excellent. And John, any initial thoughts on SDGs? How are you seeing these at Brookings?
I think when we look out at the world, we see, the SDGs are often misunderstood. And having worked at the UN, I think they're often described as something the UN came up with, therefore the world should care about. I think they're actually quite the opposite. They're something the world told the UN not to forget about, because each of those 17 goals has a crucial constituency that says, you can't forget about this. We have to stay on the world's checklist. And more importantly, we need a change of pace to get this goal to happen. So right now, we're in a place where we're very much stuck as a world, I would say. I think that's a very pervasive feeling. There are some bright spots of hope and innovations that have come out of the recent crises. We can get into those. But there's a mix of things that either need a big boost or are individually stuck or moving in the wrong direction. And what we really, really need, in my view, is a massive investment strategy, not just for the SDGs, but to help get the world going again. And that's what I think a forum like this can really help people think through.
Thank you, John. Chido, to follow up on that, what are sort of the development trends that can be capitalized on to help everyone get access back up to speed?
Okay, I think if you may just allow me to divert briefly, based on the previous intervention and speaks about investment, that we need to go back to investing. But I think that when we started this off, there were investments that went in. And I think we need to strengthen investment when it comes to the way that we monitor and evaluate the implementation and look at how we can reevaluate that to ensure that we continuously be able to implement in a way that's more sustainable in rescuing them. When it comes to looking at best practices, especially on the development side, I would say that technological innovation is very important. Rapidly developing technologies, have reshaped the lives of communities, of families, and individuals around the world through providing new goods and services. So it's important that we leverage on the access of technology and utilize that for innovation when it comes to this.
Any specifics that come to mind?
Any specific that come to mind when it comes to that is, I think we could look at perhaps the bottom of the pyramid, for example, consumers creating new industries and markets, and changing demand for labor and capital is very important. New technologies have been recognized by the 2030 Agenda as well as important means for implementing the SDGs across economies and social and environmental dimensions as well, and as a critical instrument to activities to address existing and emerging challenges as well. So I think that approach would be very, very important.
Yes,
Just
please.
to add to that, Peter, I mean, I'm not sure if these are trends, but I would say observations, things that we found out, particularly during the response to the pandemic. The first one was that we saw very clearly who is being left behind in our communities. We saw that those who are already marginalized are the ones who are getting more marginalized in the response to a pandemic, in the response to a conflict. We saw how we are stalling progress when it comes to the HIV response. We saw that the Human Development Report this year by UNDP showed that we are for the first time showing regress. We are seeing less investments in education and more young people out of school and out of jobs in the world today. And if you look at, people, young women and girls, people living with disabilities, refugees, these challenges are, of course, amplified by more and more scale. So we are now realizing that we are actually not putting those who are left behind first, we are actually leaving them furthest behind. So whatever we learn from these trends, I think the response has to be that we put them ahead of us. And the second trend that I've seen is this weird sort of convolution where we know where the problem is, but we are not finding the solution to that. For an example, education is the most affected sector, or one of the most affected sectors during the pandemic, right? We had 1.6 billion children and young people out of school. We still have close to 300 million children and youth out of school. But 2/3 of developing countries cut their education funding, and 1/3 of developed countries cut their education funding. So education is the most affected, but we are cutting funding to education. 1 in 5 young people between 15 to 24 say their mental health is getting worse after the pandemic. Only 2% of our health budgets are being allocated to mental health. So I think there's this mismatch between what is needed, the urgent needs, particularly of the largest generation of people in the world today, and where our investments are going to. So I think we really have to find the right formula of where we invest and how we invest in order to make sure that the investments we are making today are actually smart and they're fit for the future.
Follow up on the technology question. Any technologies that you are excited about? Anything that you're seeing that could help accelerate opportunities?
I definitely think the window of opportunity that the pandemic opened for using technology for remote education and online learning is a massive opportunity. But still, it's not an opportunity, it's a privilege for most people around the world. Still today, 2.2 billion children and young people don't have an internet connection at home, right? But we're talking about that as the reality, which it is not. So I think to talk about technology, we have to first talk about equitable access to technology and connectivity for everyone, but at the same time also digital literacy and digital education, particularly for young women and girls who are being left behind in our communities.
John, any thoughts on that, specifically on the technology question, either specific technologies or just more access to the internet to make some of these technologies a reality?
Yeah, and I'm so glad this has come up. Full disclosure, we recently published a whole book on breakthroughs and how they're in technology and how crucial they are
Great.
to get the SDGs on track. So this is a massive need. And I would say it's not an either or between investment technology, it's an all the above. Because there's so many things where, to get people who need the technology to have access, there needs to be some investment, there needs private, public. But just to answer your question on the technology specifically, I'll give you three that I love. One example is, and we've seen really in the digital space, cash transfers in places like Togo. Through the pandemic, a pioneering minister of digital technology there, they worked with some extraordinary new AI-informed science to get hyper-targeted, hyper-fast, immediate support to the poorest people in the country, hundreds of thousands of people at the beginning, then it's expanded. And this has actually helped change the way the world has understood how quickly we could actually be ending extreme poverty. Other countries like Democratic Republic of Congo have since rolled this out, and others have done it too. So we know that even though this end of extreme poverty has been kind of a lofty, too far away target, in my view, it's now utterly achievable. We could get there extremely quickly, and places like Togo are leading the way. A second, of course, is in the health science. We're seeing massive breakthroughs. Of course, mRNA vaccines are a great breakthrough that no one knew about a few years ago. There are many, many things, especially around community-based healthcare and trust building, where we're seeing to go along with the science and the diagnostics, massive breakthroughs that can help on not just the infectious disease, but also even non-communicable diseases. And then a third, I would say, a big, big one is food science. We are seeing many breakthroughs in agriculture in everything from crop technology to micro-irrigation and the solar systems that could support them in very low-income places. And we're also seeing things like the potential replacement of fertilizer with biology-based technologies. So we have massive breakthroughs that could help bend those curves in addition to the investments that are needed to actually roll them out.
Great. No, that's really, and thank you for those specifics, John. Chido, we've talked about some of the opportunities here. How can businesses be more active in this? I mean, I've written about this a lot. A lot of the major companies in this country love to put the SDG logos all over their sustainability reports. How can businesses be more engaged in the SDG, and where are the opportunities for business to be doing more?
Okay, I think firstly we need to invest in skills and knowledge. It's very important that we do so. Again, taking back to the young people. And that's where business come in terms of having that capacity to be able to engage young people and invest in them when it comes to the skills and knowledge that are required for the SDGs. Secondly, it's important that we have cooperation, and this cooperation comes with a multi-sectoral approach. It cannot just be the private sector in a silo. The private sector needs to work with the governments, they need to work with the public sector, as well as with the young people. The moment we cooperate together and we integrate this, then we can have better impact. I found that being in this role, it involves working with the governments in Africa, the 55 member states when it comes to youth affairs. But often we have not fully blended that in terms of how we integrate the businesses into that and the young people versus working in silos, because we need this as well for the young people. Again, we need to create that access for the private sector and the businesses to directly invest into young people and young people's businesses. How do we create that platform where we also ensure that when we do so, we build their capabilities and their capacity? Because you find often there is this stigma that comes with being young. First of all, we're often seen as volunteers than professionals, yet there's so much we can bring into businesses. We're professionals as well, So how can we ensure that when we've done that, businesses also see us as professionals that they can invest in, and the ones that can also bring impact to SDGs, not just volunteers that just come and go and help whenever needed to put that logo there. I think it's very important. And if we think that, okay, maybe at this time, again, I'm saying this because, I come from the private sector background. I actually worked in the banking sector for 7 years. And I found that we always look at the risk, like what's the risk that's going to come
Sure.
when it comes to investing
Martin
in young
was
people.
talking about that.
But, we also need to look at how can we mitigate that risk. Let's look at how we can mitigate that risk. That mitigation can come through training the young people. If we're going to invest in them and want to ensure that there's sustainability in what they're doing, then we need to train them. We need to mentor them. We need to ensure there's intergenerational mentorship and guidance, build their capacity to what we're going to invest in.
Excellent.
If I could add.
Yes, I was going to ask. Yes,
that,
please.
Peter, completely agree with what Shido is saying, and I think so many years after the SDGs, we still see a lot of greenwashing happening, a lot of SDG washing happening, as you said, where companies still to a large extent think that SDGs are a corporate social responsibility project that they're supposed to do, whereas what we're really looking for is a transformation of the business model. And I think the trick here is that it might have worked so far, but the upcoming generation of consumers, particularly the Gen Z, cannot be fooled by that. I think they're very conscious when it comes to what they're consuming, what they're purchasing, and as long as companies do not adhere to those values, to the SDGs, to the Paris Agreement, and to those commitments that we've agreed as an international community, it's going to be very hard for them to sustain their business model this way. So I think this, being conscious about this, is really important for private sector as well.
That's excellent. Can I follow up? And it kind of leads off of what you just said, but what you spoke about in the beginning that struck me, accountability. What do you mean by that? And can you just elaborate on why you chose to repeat that point?
Yeah, I think a lot of the times, when I convene young people at the UN, and they sometimes, walk around the different rooms and the halls in the UN, and they ask, okay, what's happening in this room? And I say, it's a meeting about this resolution or this commitment. And they say, okay, so now all the countries will go home and implement it. And I say, well, yeah, some of them will,
Right.
some of them will not.
Right.
And then they ask, so what happens if they don't? And the answer is, of course, nothing really happens if they don't, right? Because many of these commitments are non-binding, they are mutually agreed resolutions, and we have not really set up a accountability mechanism, either it is for the SDGs or the others, for various reasons. But I think that contributes to this huge lack of trust between young people and political institutions, which are actually turning them away from constructively engaging in these issues that affect their lives, whether it's education or climate action or so on and so forth. And this erosion of trust can really result in various ways, can show itself in various ways, even in the extreme conflicts between different groups, right, and the people that they're governing. So my thesis here is that we cannot solve new problems with old solutions or with the same people in the room. And that's where what Shido said earlier, we need to bring innovation into the room, we need to bring creativity into the room, and we need to bring the lived realities of people going through these issues into the room. And that's where I think really there is a massive potential to work with young people around the world, particularly in the continent of Africa, which is really bustling with this population of youth who are willing to contribute with their energy, with their enthusiasm, with their expertise. But we still haven't found ways to utilize that energy that they are offering into making progress in our social and political lives. For an example, if we look at an average age of a world leader today is 62 years old, whereas the average age of a global citizen is about 29, And this gap is biggest in Africa. So how do we make our decision-making rooms more, representative? How do we get more young people into decision-making, into running for political office? How do we get more women into running for political office and getting into these decision-making bodies? Because at the end of the day, whatever we agree, it's our elected political leaders in countries who will make the decisions of which policies to prioritize, where to put the funding in, right? So we have to make sure that our governance systems are inclusive and really respond to the needs of today and of the future.
Great, thank you very much. John, let me see how, are there any, Jathamo was talking about cannot solve problems with old solutions, and you talked about some of the very specific technology benefits, but what sort of the more social problems that we're facing? Yes, the technology is very helpful and presents a lot of opportunity. But what about some of these more ingrained social challenges, how might you be thinking about addressing these problems with new solutions?
Well, this is where I think the SDGs can help if they're used right, and they need to be used right, because I think the whole SDG washing, or what a colleague might call the clip art of SDG, just put a stamp on what you're doing already, is a real risk. And just like in ESG world, you just say something's ESG, but there's nothing materially different, and we're seeing the comeuppance in the markets now on that issue. I think SDGs need to be just as savvy to those issues too. And so what we've seen is on issues, take non-communicable disease, child obesity is a massive issue going in the wrong direction around the world. This is not a single technology problem. This is actually a problem that we don't even know exactly what to do about. Ask any expert in the field. This needs a multi-pronged strategy. You need everything from urban planners to transport people to schools people to health specialists. And what we need is a way for bottom-up learning across communities to say, we found some way to make a dent on this problem. What have you found? And there needs to be real communities of practice where all these experts are brought together to get on the same page, literally and figuratively, around these measured outcomes of how our kids doing in their, BMIs. And so these are real challenges that we have to be thinking through on a practical basis. Mental health, I would put in the same category. It's a massive global epidemic. Violence, and urban violence in particular, massive global issue, huge variation around the world. But we have a process, 17 rooms that we've just been convening with Rockefeller Foundation, bring experts from around the world. And so much of this comes down to how do you boil down so often the lessons that are being brought up in one community so that another community can start to draw from it and make it their own. If we use these sustainable development goals in the right way, the business leaders can be just as much part of that solution as the community leaders and the political leaders. And here I would just add, the notion of accountability of liberal democracies is crucial. Globally right now, we are not in a moment where the liberal democracies are seen as the ones delivering on the SDGs. They're often seen as maybe not following through on their commitments, the high-income countries. We have to be very clear. Even the United States government has not done a self-assessment on how it's doing on the SDGs, and has been a little bit moot, even under the Biden administration, on its view on the SDGs. This is a huge consequence for the world that is looking for sources of light to bring people together on what people care about, which is, how's my family doing? How's my community doing? And we have to understand this just as much within the domestic economies, or within the advanced economies on their domestic issues, as within any emerging or lower income economy, because every community is grappling with these issues.
Great. And actually, I wanted to see if I could get you to respond to the question I asked Chido on business opportunities. Where do you see, and you mentioned, I love that phrase, the clip art of SDGs, where do you see business being more sincere, or the opportunities for them to be more sincere, more concrete, more accountable on following through on SDG opportunities?
You said
No, to John, sorry. I asked you that already.
You want to go first?
For me?
For John, yes. No, I've touched on the ladies here for that, but do you have any thoughts on that as well?
I think the business side, there are a few key pieces, and it does have to fuse with the ESG conversation. And the ESG conversation in the global economy comes from risk management, ultimately. That's how it started. But SDGs are about outcomes of how a society is doing. So I think every business needs to be thinking about what's its core product in any part of the world and how that's contributing. But also it needs to think about its own operations and how they're consistent with the SDGs. It's a double-pronged question for every business. So we have some places where in every community in the world, there's a business that's delivering some core product that's helping the community move forward, and we need to understand that and find a way to capture it. This is why things like the consolidation of the metrics and standards, international sustainable accounting efforts are hugely important. But also we have to understand a major barrier to this is cost of capital. So many companies, especially in emerging economies, are facing way higher borrowing rates or cost of capital than in the advanced economies. For governments alone, it's about 2%, 2 to 3% borrowing, as the cheapest capital in a society. In the emerging economies, it's typically well above 10%.
Right.
If you're a business and you can't grow, this is a major issue, say, for low carbon technologies, where even where the technology is now cheaper, it's not affordable to get the capital to deploy for a business to get it out to your markets. And we need to be understanding how this cost of capital is impeding businesses in the economies that need it most for themselves and for the world.
Thank you, John. One question from the audience, and please keep sending us the questions. Jethma, I'll pitch this to you because you brought up the issue of accountability, but I'll get others to weigh in as well. It comes into the government's role. How can governments hold the private sector accountable for issues on climate change, exploitation, low income, sort of abuses? How have you seen examples? Can you talk about how the government can play a role as a regulator in holding the private sector accountable?
I think it's, partly the role of the government to make sure that, not just the government but private sector as well adheres to these different standards. And I would say the simple answer to that is to come up with effective laws and policies to regulate business environments to make sure that they adhere to these standards. And the standards have already been developed internationally, right? John was referring to a few of them, but also we have so many different compacts and collectives and guidelines that have been developed for businesses, not only to adhere to climate targets, but also to human rights standards, labor standards that has been developed as well. So, but as I said, there's a huge gap in what's agreed in paper versus what's been implemented. So we really need to bridge that gap. But I also think it shouldn't always be government versus private sector, or civil society versus government, or civil society versus private sector, because at the end of the day we are all operating in the same ecosystem, right? All of our contributions ultimately adapt to the achievement of the targets and the goals. So it's also important to explore partnerships between private and public partnerships. How do we work together to achieve results, even in sectors that are currently struggling, say education, on health? How can governments work together with the private sector to find those innovations, find those solutions, and find the right investments to do so? Another interesting statistic that comes to mind is if the SDGs are properly implemented, we will be creating about 380 million new jobs in our world, right? And these jobs will not be created by the government. Majority of these jobs will be created by the private sector, which is also resulting in the growth of those companies, but also enriching the lives of people in those countries. So I think private sector also need to see this as an investment that they make in the future, but not necessarily as a cost to their current business practices.
Chido, any thoughts on that, please?
Yes, I think I agree definitely with Jayatma in terms of effective laws and policies. And it's also important that we continuously review the policies, given that we're living in a world that's constantly changing. We've seen what happened with COVID-19. And therefore, it's important that they're very much aligned to what will be happening at that specific time when you put the policies in place. And in addition to this, I'd say governance frameworks and structures are very important. And that will also come back to the accountability. How can we have a proper governance structures in place, be it committees that are made up of the private sector, of the public sector, government institutions, meeting periodically as well to review on this process is very important too.
And Chido, a question for you on, and this gets back to something that John said on how liberal democracies is seen as not following through, some of the challenges that they are having and following through on the SDGs comes into, and the one dynamic of that is capitalism, the free markets. How can, the question was how to achieve SDGs in societies that put capital above everything else. So a lot of these might involve some partnerships or even outright sacrifices. Are there concerns or are there opportunities where to overcome sort of the capitalist mindset to achieve SDGs?
Okay, I think this will also come with a culture approach. We need to be human-centered first before anything else. But that would take us having that mindset and that culture, that it's about the people at the end of the day. And the people are the ones that are affected the most in terms of the implementation of SDGs and how far we've gone with that.
Jeff, any thoughts
Yeah,
on that as
I mean,
well?
I do think that the future of business or future of anything that we do is to really put people and the planet at the front and profit at the back. And that's the only way we can achieve the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and basically a healthy, livable planet. So there's no argument, I think, that addressing the root causes of the crises we are facing today is extremely important. And for me, those root causes go back to as old as colonialism, racism, patriarchy, sexism, and even capitalism, extreme capitalism to a certain extent. So.
And I realize I've hugged a lot of the questions on the panels here, so if there's anybody from the audience who has questions for our panelists, please feel free to raise your hand and we will come around with a microphone. As you're thinking of questions, John, any thoughts on that? I know that kind of goes back to, I was referring back to your point, obviously liberal democracies are capitalist driven. What are your thoughts on how can the SDGs be really accomplished in a capitalist society? Do we need to overcome sort of the capital intrinsic nature of how that sort of seeks out profits and profits alone, how that can be sort of overcome to make progress on SDGs?
It's such an interesting question. I think it's important to distinguish, even among the so-called high-income countries, the role of the market is different in a social democracy of Scandinavia versus the United States, for example. True. And I think that there's no single way of looking at this. And of course, India's a liberal democracy. Most would still argue there's obviously huge tensions, and it's actually made tremendous progress on many issues in the past several years on poverty-related issues. But we have huge questions around, how do we think through costs and benefits? And it used to be seen as, doing a lot of these investments was a cost, whereas now we're seeing things like, well, if you're in California or if, you're dealing with forest fires out in the west of my home country of Canada and you can't see or breathe, that's actually quite expensive. Yeah. And we're seeing in Pakistan, it's extremely expensive right now, this massive catastrophe on both human and economic terms. So I think that the notion of what a cost means is different. And we're also seeing, as much as the S&P 500 might gyrate day to day right now, it's up massively in the long term. Sure. But in the United States, life expectancy is not doing so well. And we're seeing the disruptions that that's causing. Again, this year, it's not just COVID. Life expectancy is going down. It's generationally declining. If your bottom line measure of life itself is going down, I think we start to see the consequences in society that this is not working as we're doing it right now. And the notion of recoupling prosperity, which everyone wants to see, that's the definition of fighting poverty, promoting prosperity, with improvements in life and living standards as people assess it themselves, is foundational. So the only thing I would add to that is on the private sector side, we are seeing movements in the investor community different from the corporate community. Yes. And this is links in the chain problem because the companies have investors and they need to make sure the investors are supporting them to do what they need to do and vice versa. And the regulators need to be asking the right questions. And the carbon price, for example, needs to be a good carbon price so everyone has the right incentives. So it all needs to fit. And I would argue we're 5 to 10 years out from this all fitting together better. We're seeing issues like the anti-forced labor legislation coming out of Australia. Affects a lot of extractive industry investors around the world. Canada is about to, I believe, pass similar legislation. UK is considering similar. This is very new because if you're an investor, you still need company-specific data on which to report the risk of forced labor in a supply chain. It's like scope 2 emissions. You're going to need the data to do it. Yeah. We have so many of these issues that we still need to develop, not just the regulation, but the tools that allow the companies to align. And I see that as a huge growth opportunity for innovators over the next 5 to 10 years and regulators to say, what's the right way to do this that works for all?
Thank you, John. I believe we have a question.
Hi, my name is Arthur Godiva. I run an innovation studio, and a lot of what we do is make programs around like incubators, accelerators, global competitions, things like that. I like what John said about bright spots, and I was curious around youth and particularly around Africa. Have you seen any bright spots that you can point to that might be good models or examples, or even just purely a bright spot that's something we can look at on how we can engage youth and around social impact, just as a more general term? Thank you.
Okay. I think there's so many examples in terms of accelerator programs that are currently going on in Africa. I'll give an example of Kenya. Kenya is a tech hub, and there's so many of them that, we've had a lot of investments coming into Kenya, investing into young people, as well as their innovations and technology. However, there's been a challenge that comes in that, and that challenge comes with, I would say maybe financial literacy for the young people, because often what happens is we have people coming in to invest, and then they buy out the companies from the young people, and afterwards young people are left with nothing from these ideas. So what has been coming up the most is actually came out in a meeting that I had with the Kenya government, specifically in terms of how my role can come in with that for the youth. And they've said that the challenge is with so many investments coming in, the accelerator programs within Africa, leveraging on this innovation that young people have, but at the end of it, they're left with nothing. And some of them, I remember there's even one example specifically, just recently where I was being told about a specific company, and this was in Egypt, and there were investment that got into that company, but he didn't fully understand the terms that at the end of it, even after the investment of over $1 million, I think he was left with something like $5,000. But he had put a lot of his time in there, a lot of innovation in there, the ideas, and at the end of it, that investment is not coming back in terms of economic development. So that, I think there's room to ensure that when we're doing so, we also have the youth in mind in terms of sustainability and what would be the end game for them. Yeah.
Just to maybe add to that, a common sort of grievance that I hear from a lot of the young entrepreneurs and innovators that we work with is that, it's not like every entrepreneurship venture gets successful, right? Only about 1 in 5 attempts get successful. Yeah. And when it fails, what sort of security nets do you have? And in a lot of places, young people cannot afford to lose because they put everything they have into these innovations, these entrepreneurship. So I think looking at also social safety nets, social security nets are extremely important if we want to foster a quality group of young entrepreneurs, particularly in low income and lower middle income countries.
That's crucial. I mean, they may have the ideas, they might have the grit, but if they don't have the safety net to catch them if the business fails, which is happens in this country all the time as well, they're not going to take that risk. Any other? Yes, please.
Thank you, Helena Kude, Deputy Permanent Representative of Namibia to the UN. I just wanted to seek your get your thoughts on unemployment. I think that's a challenge that is really pressing for many young people, especially in developing countries, but also in developed countries. I just wanted to hear what your youth-led solutions are for unemployment, and maybe just to in the context of vulnerabilities, if I had to give you an unlimited budget as young people and say, here, fix all the problems of the world, where do you see resources needing to be channeled for young people?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the second question first. I would put that money into strengthening young people's participation in society and in politics mainly. Because as I said, I see as a root cause for a lot of the issues that we are facing today that our decision making is not representative of the people that we are trying to serve. So I would invest that money in creating effective, inclusive, transparent governance systems where young people can have a voice, where they can share power to make decisions about their own future. And I think if we fix that layer, then we can fix, the other issues from education to health to employment to all the else, because they come with the lived realities of living through those issues, like living through unemployment, living through being out of school. So I would say if I have that unlimited budget, I would probably invest in that. But to the first question, unemployment was already a huge challenge before the pandemic. and the pandemic really worsened it. About 1 in 5 young people lost their jobs during the pandemic, and we don't see the recovery happening as fast as the loss. So we are facing a lot of issues both in developed countries and in developing countries when it comes to getting young people back on the labor market and back on the job market. And I think this is worse in low income and lower middle income countries, where about 70% of the young people were in informal employment. So we don't even have records of how many jobs were lost or how many actually lost their livelihoods. One main reason is actually this skills mismatch that we see in the transition from school to work. And this continues to grow as the fourth industrial revolution, progresses, because young people are not getting the skills that they need in order to be employable in the current labor market. And this is, of course, one of the topics that we will explore starting tomorrow in the Transforming Education Summit that the Secretary General will convene, to really look at how do we transform our education system so we equip young people with the right skills that they need in order to be successful in the labor market. So I think while there is lack of jobs, I think young people are also struggling to access the existing jobs because of this skills gap.
That's very true.
Chido, did you have any thoughts on that?
I think I totally agree with their
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is
Can I say one thing on that? Sorry.
Okay, real quick, John, yes.
Sorry, just to chime in. I think we have to understand, you asked about unlimited budget. Our global investments in secondary education are pretty much the most limited budget in the world. $100 trillion global economy, we put about $2 billion a year into what is the biggest skill building mechanism we have. It's almost a zero, and especially for girls and young women, we're missing all of the capacity development opportunities that is so desperately needed to match with that rapidly evolving job market. So we just need to understand this is the biggest mismatch in the world, in my view, investing in our young people's actual skill building and the jobs that they're going to want to get.
Thank you, please, yes.
Thank you. My name is Jessica Mshama from Tanzania, East African Community Youth Ambassador and an entrepreneur. I run a first digital school in Tanzania for nursery and primary school. So my question goes to both of you. What ways should we increase the awareness of the importance of digital skills in schools? And for my experience after starting, I've noticed that there's 3 groups that really need to be empowered, supported to understand very well the importance of digital school. We have the parents that are not aware of how to adapt on the new ways of learning, and they have children in this century that need the digital learning skills, and they're trying to adapt towards it. So we have also the teachers who are not well informed on how to teach these children, how to get the perfect skills of digital learning. So in your ways, what ways do you recommend, as we're going through the General Assembly, to have these 3 groups having to understand and adapt to the digital learning in the modern age that we are in? Thank you.
Do you want to take that?
Okay. I think looking at that, it's very important, again, having an enabling environment. I'm trying to imagine where you're in a situation, we're faced with poverty, lack of food, lack of access to water, and then we also have digital. Where exactly do we then place it in this? And how do we ensure that we start speaking about the benefits that come with that digital literacy? Because at that time, if you're looking at a parent, or even as a youth, your first thought of mind is on, I need to get food on the table for my children. But at the same time, we're now speaking about, I need to make sure that they're up to date with what's happening in technology and digital, innovation. So it's a matter of creating that enabling environment and also looking at the positive factors to say, okay, if we ensure that we have this enabling environment for digital literacy, these are the benefits that can come for the future for my children when it comes to economic development and opportunities for them and thinking towards the future. So it's about how we can create that environment as well, because at the moment, I'm sure they'll also be thinking of now, how do we survive in the now? But we also need to ensure that we think about how do we survive in the future and create that for the children. When it comes to the teachers, it also has to do with how do we enable the teachers? Again, it goes back to that integration and cooperation of the public sector, the private sector, and everyone getting involved, because for us to enable them, it means we need to build their capacities too. And that can also come into policy when it comes to education system. I'm really glad with the education summit that's coming up and the wonderful work that has been done, through what will be presented to the General Assembly on the Youth Declaration and the process that JAP's office has been working on. And I think it's very important that, with that in mind, that accountability, when those recommendations come, how to ensure that it then goes down to national domestication as well as national implementation, and that responsibility that comes to it. An example, again, in one of discussions that we previously had with youth, specifically in Africa and education, was on thinking around advisory councils, even bringing young people on board, that when we're making these recommendations, we have advisory councils and youth groups that are also there to look at the implementation, the monitoring, the evaluation as well, which is very important in that deliverable. Yeah.
I mean, you're probably an expert in this than we are, and I would say just to continue what you're doing, and I think scaling up the model that you are having in Tanzania in other places would be sort of my answer to that, because I think both needs to happen at the same time. One is government and other stakeholders increasing access to technology, because as Chido said, if you're suffering with poverty and food shortages and lack of access to basic services, then digital technologies seem like a luxury, right? So making connectivity accessible to everyone everywhere has to happen, but we cannot wait until we achieve 100% connectivity in order to start implementing digital skills, right? So I think finding out solutions like the one that you described and scaling them up, and I think connecting it to also the earlier question of finding how youth entrepreneurship and innovation can couple with social impact and help deliver the most basic services to people, in this case education, is something that I think governments need to be increasingly looking at.
Do we have time for one more question? Yes, ma'am?
Do I need the mic or?
Oh, no, just I think, raise your voice, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jadavna. Thank you, Shido and John. I'm Patricia Chavez from the DESA, UN Secretariat. And thank you. I'm Patricia Chavez from the UN Secretariat. And as you all know, the SDG Summit is going to take place next year in 2023. And is the midpoint in reviewing the implementation of the SDGs. So, but how do we recreate enthusiasm from young people in the SDG Summit next year? So how do we get them excited? How do they want to be engaged? And what do they want out of that summit next September in 2023? Thank you.
And thank you for reminding us. I wasn't aware of that, so thank you.
No, I mean, I do think, though, that many young people are aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, say compared to the Millennium Development Goals, right, which was before. I've seen SDGs being implemented and used as a model in the most rural places of the world, in sort of, in rural schools in Bangladesh. I went to a youth coding camp in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. Yeah. I saw SDGs there. So, it's not like governments or somebody is going and telling them, okay, these are the SDGs, you implement them in your project. No, but they learn about it, they own it, they try to implement it as much as they can in their communities. But what I was saying, I mean, I'm coming back to my first answer, is this frustration that they have. We are trying to do what we can in our communities, but we are not seeing the same level of commitment. We are not seeing the same level of investment from world leaders and our elected leaders. And I think it won't make a lot of sense if we get young people excited about the SDGs and still if we don't see results, right? So I think really making sure that we are able to show results, show concrete commitment and concrete investment is the only way that you can build trust of young people in these institutions and in these frameworks. And that's the only way that they can be excited about then what's there for the future, right? So I would go back to sort of my answer on accountability and making sure that we really show concrete results and concrete outcomes. And that, I think, leaders has to show by commitment. Because right now what we are seeing is, even if you take the General Assembly that will kickstart next week, many world leaders come to New York and they speak to their national audiences. right? Many are trying to get their speaking slot to get it aligned with their national primetime TV times, because they're here to talk to their national audiences and not to really work in multilateral cooperation and in partnership, which is so direly needed for us to rescue the SDGs and put ourselves back on track. So I would highly call on and highly recommend that in order to get young people excited and interested and trusted in these systems, that our political leaders show good faith and show goodwill and show commitment.
Chido, any final thoughts on that?
I think just, with what Jathan said, I totally agree with that. The political commitments are very, very important. So it goes beyond being ceremonial as well. But what can we actually deliver? Yeah.
And John, any final thoughts in response to that?
Yeah, I have a slightly different view. I think I'm all for political accountability, but I don't have great hopes right now that in the next 12 months the world's going to fix itself. And I actually think we need to flip the question and say, how do we let the young people of the world take the SDGs into their own hands so that they're the ones empowered to take action against these goals? We have this device, 17 rooms. We have people from Nigeria to South America to Iceland and other parts of the world where they're saying, what can we do in our community for the SDGs? Why don't we have a day the week before, September 17th, before all these world leaders get together to say, here's what we're doing, and create a little pressure to say, hope you do your part too. I don't think the world is wanting to wait on political leaders right now. I think the world wants to see progress and they want to help drive it themselves, young people more than anyone.
Well, thank you very much. I think we'll have to leave it there. Chido, Jatham, and John, thanks so much for your time and for participating today. Thanks again. Thanks again, Jatham. And Elizabeth, please. And finally, today we're joined here by Elizabeth Cousins, CEO of the UN Foundation. Fantastic panels this morning. I'm really amazed. I just wanted to see if you have any reaction, any thoughts to build off of what was discussed this morning.
Oh, how much time do you have? I have a million and one thoughts to build off of that. So first, just really delighted to see you all here. Great to be back with the FT this year for this preview of the UN General Assembly next week. And really huge thanks to all of our panelists, virtual and in person, because that was just a spectacular overview of what matters, what's at stake, what's possible. And that's exactly what we should be talking about on the eve of the General Assembly.
Can you talk a little bit about your role at the UN Foundation, just for folks in the audience who might not be aware? What does your day-to-day look like?
Every day is different, just like it is at the UN. So we were created 25 years ago. We were created out of a philanthropic gift from media entrepreneur Ted Turner, whom many of you will know, who believed that global problems need global solutions. He believed that the UN was an indispensable institution, and he believed that the UN would benefit from a strategic partner, an independent organization that could help build partnerships, help drive new support, and help create the possibility for and contribute to the possibility for more novel coalitions around solving big challenges. And we've been doing that in different ways over the last 25 years. We are about to turn 25 next year, so it's a big birthday for us. Great. We're sort of thinking generationally about what did the last generation of our work look like and what does it need to look like next. And a lot of it is about what you've just been hearing from speakers this morning.
From the speakers this morning, I mean, what sort of inspired you? What were sort of the optimistic tones that you took from the conversations? Were any things, I mean, there's a lot of challenges in the world that we were well aware of, but are there any themes from today's talks that you're particularly like, wow, okay, I'll take that into conversations we're going to have next week, perhaps?
Well, sure. Look, and let's step back. We do know that when world leaders come to the UN next week, they are coming against the backdrop of a horrific vortex of intersecting crises around the world globally and regionally. We know all the dimensions of those, whether it's food, fuel, and finance, whether it's climate, whether it's still the long tail of COVID that many countries are dealing with. At the same time, we are seeing mounting pressure. You heard some of that in the expression of what we're hearing from young people around the world, from some business leaders, from communities, about what they want to see from their leaders. I think most people recognize, first of all, they know that a better world is possible. They certainly want that for their families. They see ways that all of our kind of established institutions may be falling down on the job, and they want something better. And I think what you heard from our speakers this morning was about some of the levers and ways to build that better future using, the energy and demand signals from different constituencies around the world, and then getting imaginative about how you organize around that.
Something that Jatham was talking about is people, government officials, government leaders who come in and try and speak to their local constituencies, and it's an illustration of isolationist thinking, perhaps. Again, looking ahead to next week, what are some of the things that you're thinking about to overcome that sort of isolationist tendencies?
Well, let me step back. I think there are a lot of things to unpack in what you just said. So first of all, I don't think we should expect politicians not to be politicians, right? We all have them. They speak to their constituencies. Many of them have been elected to speak to their constituencies. I don't think that means that they can't also cooperate in international fora. So the whole job of the United Nations is not to cancel out domestic politics. It's actually to enable leaders to come together around issues that unite them, usually, hopefully, because they're the issues that matter the most to their citizens. So I think it's worth saying a little bit about cooperation because, it's a little bit frail these days. We all know all the ways that it's challenged. But I want to remind people listening, even in this incredibly divisive moment that we're living through right now, divisive on so many levels, globally and domestically in many places, cooperation is actually happening and getting things done. So let's just take the crisis we started this morning talking about. Even as horrific as that is, and even though peace is not clearly in sight in Ukraine in the near term, the UN negotiated a Black Sea grain deal that is helping to start to lower food prices around the world. The International Atomic Energy Agency got nuclear inspectors into the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in the middle of a hot war.
Yeah.
I mean, that's extraordinary. And we haven't talked about it today, but this spring, a couple big things that happened. A landmark plastics treaty was negotiated at the UN Environment Assembly. You got countries, I think, against everybody's expectation, agreeing at the World Health Assembly to start to negotiate a pandemic treaty. So things can be very vexed in certain areas, horrifically so, but there can also be openings for cooperation in others. And that's the kind of thing we need to be using the UN to find, exploit, and leverage in other parts of the world.
Excellent, excellent. Any other thoughts on how that can be replicated to overcome other challenges? I mean, are there things, particular tactics from those success stories that can be replicated elsewhere, especially looking ahead to some of the other big challenges down the road?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, cooperation isn't easy, or we'd be doing it all the time. I spent the first 20 years of my career working on peace processes. Peace is not made between friends, it's made between adversaries. And so, the job of creating space for cooperation, working on the conditions that make it possible, that's hard and crucial work, because if you look at the global landscape today, if you look at the domestic agendas today, I don't think you can see too many challenges that people and communities face that are better solved by not working with each other. They're all vastly better solved, and some of them are only going to be solved by much more heroic and imaginative forms of cooperation, but we need to do that differently. So what kinds of things should we be looking at? I think, first, the UN has actually made really important strides in recent years to open its doors and open its corridors to a wide variety of constituents, of expertise, capacity, resources. So you see the private sector here in a way that you never did 20 years ago. You see young people, still not enough and not in enough decision-making roles. Clearly that needs to be improved, but much more than ever before. Civil society voices, philanthropies. And they're not just showing up, they're actually coming here to do deals, to solve problems, to think about how they can come together in coalition around particular challenges that do need the expertise, resources, and perspectives of a much more diverse base of interests and expertise to solve. So I think, there are a lot of things to say about that, but that's a really important domain of activity, not just here at the UN, it's happening everywhere. Importantly, I think certainly the vision of the current UN leadership, it's something we work on a lot at the UN Foundation. The UN is a big idea, it's a lot of institutions, but it's also about the notion that people can cooperate to solve common challenges. And part of what we need to be thinking about in the years ahead, it's not just doing everything here in New York. Most things shouldn't be done here in New York, but how do you harness the kind of cooperative energy in other places? How do you get much more creative about different configurations of countries, of companies, of constituencies around problem solving? That can come back up and ladder up to the UN if it needs to, and it's part of the larger story of just being effective at modern cooperation and problem solving.
So what needs to be done, what can be done to create more resilient networks of global cooperation? How can the UN, private sector, local governments help to overcome some of the challenges that we're facing?
Yeah, so a few things I'd point to. So one is just this whole question about modernizing the base of what the UN means. So that is about continuing to diversify who shows up, leveling the playing field much more than we've ever done among countries and across constituencies. A lot of things to say about that, but it's about really refreshing who the UN what it is, what it's for, and who shows up and actually has influence and power. That's one. Second, resilience is a big word and it means a lot of things, but I think we all know we are not just in a world of crisis and shocks, but it's going to get deeper and harder. We're going to have to get vastly better in all of our institutions and all of our communities at dealing with the unexpected or dealing with the expected, but it's bigger and fiercer and sooner than we all thought it was coming. And there's a lot of interesting discussion and thinking about how to do that better. The Secretary General has called for a new kind of global emergencies platform to deal precisely with, emergencies of a multidimensional character and a massive scale. And we heard earlier today from two leaders of this global crisis response group that the UN has put together around the food, fuel, and energy crisis, David Nabarro and Damilola Ogunbiyi representing two of them. That's a little bit of a trial run at exactly the kind of cross-sector, cross-dimensional global response mechanism we need. So that's another dimension of resilience to think about.
Can you elaborate on that global crisis response group? I wasn't aware of it until the panelists talked about it, but kind of how that got started and what sort of the challenges that's aiming to fight could include.
Well, this is a massive effort that was set up after the war in Ukraine.
Okay.
Obviously, there is a whole set of crisis response going on around the war in Ukraine itself, but then the cascading impacts across the global economy, particularly in the food system, particularly around finance, and particularly around fuel, has created this cascade of effects that, of course, we're all talking about. The most acute and poignant piece of that being the tremendous increase in food insecurity and countries on the brink of famine. So the UN stood up this global crisis response group across a number of international institutions. So it involves the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It involves UNCTAD, the Food and Agriculture Organization. It involves the private sector. The International Chamber of Commerce sits at that table.
Okay.
And so it's really about trying to look at the full dimensions of a rapidly unfolding crisis and get our arms around who needs to do what to address it.
You've talked a couple times about the private sector, and you said the private sector is involved in the UN General Assembly week as it never used to before. Are other opportunities, both in sort of a carrot and stick approach, to get the private sector more involved and helping more, again, to the accountability question, being more accountable for getting involved in some of these challenges, to solve some of these challenges?
I guess there are carrots and sticks, but I think more about incentives and opportunities. Right. So I think first of all, there are a lot of different ways that companies show up at the UN. They show up, obviously, in big events. More importantly, to my mind, they show up in actual conversations about policy outcomes and about solutions. And there are many illustrations of this from the group of investors who have come together, convened by the Secretary General, to talk about ways to increase sustainable investment and financing from the investment community in particular. The UN Global Compact is a huge platform for private sector engagement here in the UN context. And you have platforms, whether I mentioned the International Chamber of Commerce, but individual companies who are very involved in partnering with the UN and other partners on a whole variety of fronts. I think that the big deep question, and it came up in the last conversation as well, is about the transformation of business models in a global economy that is changing by the day, many dimensions of which we know, but many of which are uncertain. And we are all going through these transitions at the same time, not just business. And we're going through it as whether you're a political leader, you're a community leader, you're wherever you live and whatever preoccupies you. We are all in the midst of a mass historical transition in our economies, societies, and technologies, and figuring that out together and how to navigate that in a productive way that creates more opportunities in the future rather than less is really the critical question for all of us.
Excellent. Any questions from the audience for Elizabeth? Anybody have thoughts, questions?
I know you're all looking forward to the UN General Assembly next week. And I would say, I think there are more world leaders coming next week than in many recent years. We have more heads of state and government during this first week than we've had in a long time.
Is that pandemic related?
No, it's partly that, but I think it's because of the gravity of the moment.
Yeah.
I think we will, yes, there are tensions aplenty. There are a lot of things a lot of people disagree about, but I think you're going to see the stirrings next week, and it will only deepen, of a recognition of how urgent it is not only to cooperate more, but to do it differently and with much greater ambition, because this is a consequential time, and I think people's citizens are demanding it of their leaders, and they rightly should, and that's what we should come to expect.
Great. Is there anything? Oh, yes. Oh, we do have a question. Yes, please.
Thank you to you both. This is a question actually to the both of you. I'd like to know, from the private sector, we see a lot of greenwashing. It is real from many companies that have questioned legitimacy in their green offering. So I'm curious, Elizabeth, if what you would need to see from a private company in terms to demonstrate genuine commitment to the SDGs and also to advancement in environmental policy.
Yeah, data and candor would be where I would start with. So look, I think it's not just companies, it's also countries. I think Jayathma was exactly right when she said, essentially, we have an accountability crisis that's causing a tremendous trust deficit in a lot of ways. And we have that nationally as well as internationally. So of course, it's a wider set of challenges. One huge critical foundation for trying to rebuild that has got to be honest accounting of behavior, however you do that and whatever makes sense in your domain. So I think, we simultaneously, to asking for honesty, have to do better at not penalizing, let's say, countries or companies for truth telling if they're falling short. So you can imagine, whether it's a company or a country, trying to do things with ambition and falling short. You actually want people to be honest about that and be able to talk about where they're falling short. Some of it is cynical greenwashing. Some of it is just that it's hard. So I think we need to find a more empirically informed, honest basis for having those conversations and pushing each other to do much better than we've done in the past. I think that's the only way through this. The good news, to my mind, is that there also are opportunities on the other end of that as well.
I think in terms of the greenwashing question, I mean, at least in the U.S., Europe is stronger in some of its regulations and defining what greenwashing is. In the U.S., it's a little bit more flimsy, so it's sort of like you might think something's greenwashing and then somebody else might have a different opinion about it. So it's still kind of coalescing around it. But in the media, I mean, we're trying to catch companies especially to keep them honest and not over-exaggerate that they're the greenest business that's ever existed. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I was curious for the United Nations Foundation internally and what you felt were the largest challenges around your internal culture and efficiency and what your strategic priorities are for the organization internally.
That's an unexpected question at a preview of the UN General Assembly. Look, I think like every organization that works in the international domain, we work in a very complex strategic environment. And so we have to think and get better at and develop more muscles around agility, around response to the unexpected. One of the things that I'm very proud of, that I'm trying to do more of at the foundation, is really to, substantially diversify our staff and expertise base. So we are an international organization. We have colleagues and staff and experts who work with us around the world. That's very important for our being able to be effective in the job that we're in, and genuinely recognizing that the best ideas and solutions, they don't come from up here. They don't come from headquarters. They don't come from capitals. They come from people and their lived experience. So everything we can do to draw on that, elevate it, and enable that to have influence, I think is going to make all of our solutions that much more effective.
Thank you both for all the amazing insights. Another question from, I guess, the private sector. Do you see currently a link between ESG and achieving SDGs and the value of a corporation? I mean, we've talked about the risks that exist, if you're not doing something. And I've heard from the investment community, there's a push towards ethical investing. But there's also this notion of what is ethical investing. Do you not invest your money, or do you invest and use your shareholder voice as activism to promote change within these companies? And so I'm just wondering, from a value perspective, do you believe that there is a tangible connection between being involved in ESG practices and promoting ESG and the value of a business? And we've talked about, again, capital and the risks, but I just wondered if you had any sort of further thoughts on that.
Well, to my mind, this is all about time frame. The right long-term bet is absolutely on sustainability. The right long-term bet is absolutely in young people and giving them the skills they need to thrive. The right long-term bet is on clean energy. And we all know that. It's a question of whether, and I think most people know that, but it's a question of whether markets get organized, whether policy frameworks get organized in a way to make it possible and valuable for companies to make those bets in the right direction. I mean, I think that's a conversation we've been having with increasing urgency, and I think you all in the private sector have been having with increasing urgency. Whatever sector you're in, that is really about the need for both foresightful policy and then for companies to do what they're supposed to do, which is to pursue profit, to do their business, but to do it in a way that is socially beneficial and environmentally productive and not depleting the very systems that we need to survive and thrive together on a planet that is already about to be 8 billion people. Right. And how many billions more by the end of this century? We are interconnected, whether we like it or not, on this planet. Our economies, our technologies, our security, our health. I mean, that gets closer and closer by the day. And there is no universe in which the kinds of economic choices that people have been making to date, that are often quite short-term and quite short-sighted, are actually in our long-term interests. So it really does go to time frame, and I think to much more future-oriented policymaking and thoughtful regulatory and institutional environments for that.
And how do you think about the ESG considerations for the Sustainable Development Goals? I mean, can the two work together? And
they have. It's the same topics. So this is as in many areas there is almost too much of a good thing. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of fragmentation we all know about. There's a lot of effort right now to align and make interoperable and much more mutually intelligible the different frameworks we have for ESG reporting. That's incredibly important, and there is no reason that shouldn't align absolutely with the Sustainable Development Goals. They're the same topics, right? It's just language and a little bit of data.
Well, Elizabeth, I think that's all the time we have for. Thank you so much for participating in the UN kickoff here, and good luck next week.
Well, thank you. Good luck to us all. It's great to see you all.
All right. And thanks everybody for coming and attending today.